Good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to this NAV Skills webinar. Today we're going to talk about Locktable. The title of the webinar was Locktable Demystified. My name is Mark Brummel. I'm a trainer for NAV Skills. I've been doing Navision for about 20 years, and this webinar is actually part of my programming masterclass. It's one of my favorite subjects, and I get so many questions about this topic. And every time I explain Locktable, at least half of my classes don't know or did not expect Locktable to work like that. And I was like, okay, this topic is so important. I'm just going to do a webinar about it. I don't care if I make less money or at all. Just think that this is just freakingly important. Before we start, some housekeeping things. If you want to ask questions, just type the questions into the question window. I have the question window collapsed, so I cannot see it right now, but Rick can actually interrupt me, or we can do questions at the end. If you go to our website, navskills.com/webinars, you will find a list of upcoming webinars. Currently, we are doing the Locktable one. Next week, we have GUIDs, which I think is equally important. And then we have the August webinars where we start extending VS Code for AL developers, and we are working with Azure Functions and Visual Studio Code. If you like what you see today, you can go to, and if you go to NAVOC Summit, with NAVOC Summit, I'm doing a pre-conference masterclass. The masterclass is not only for developers from end users, it's actually mainly targeted for developers from partners. And in this 2-day masterclass, I will deep dive into clean code, design patterns, and how to write code in an easy upgradable way. If you missed one of our webinars, you can always go back to our YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com/user/brummelds, you can go to the playlists. I recently added a playlist with a bunch of videos around Visual Studio Code. In this video, these videos I explain how to install VS Code on your local system and how to get started with Visual Studio Code and do basic stuff like debugging. And of course, here we have the webinars, the past webinars, that in case you missed one, you can always go back and look here, right? So if we go back to PowerPoint, I prepared a really important slide for today. This is the slide for today. It's a blank slide. Today we are only going to do live stuff. So we are going to talk about Locktable and what Locktable means in NAV. And I wanted to start with showing an example of where Locktable is in NAV. Let's go into a code unit that most of us are probably familiar with, code unit 212, resource journal post line. The reason I'm using resource journal post line is because the resource journal is really easily to understand. If I design this code unit, you will see that I only have one function called code, and all of the code is in this one function. And here you can see that in the code, which is the posting routine, we go in and we do a test near and a test far, and then we do if next entry number equals 0, then resource ledger entry.locktable, and then resource ledger entry.findLast. Next entry number is a global variable. If I go to globals, you will see that next entry number is a global variable, which means that if I post a set of lines, this variable will be kept in memory, right? So every time I post a set of lines, this is kept in memory. So the first time it's doing this, it's doing the Locktable and the findLast. The Locktable is also easy to find in the general journal post line code unit. If I go into code unit 12 and I start searching for Locktable, you will see that there's a bunch of Locktables on different entries. but this is the most important one. This is the function start posting, and before it starts posting, it does a global GL entry.locktable and a find last, right? So what does that mean? What actually happens if you do a lock table? First, before we dive into that, I want to show you something in SQL Server Management Studio. As you know, Navision is now running fully on SQL Server Management on SQL Server database. Before we only ran on SQL Server, we had a hybrid situation where Navision would run both on its own database, which we call the native database or the classic database or the proprietary database. And side by side, we had SQL Server. And for those of you who are really old, go back with Navision a long time, you will remember that before we had the hybrid situation, the native database was the only option. I'm currently working with my demo database NAV10, and let's just create a new query. And I'll just make the font a little bit bigger, and I'll just say select star from customer. You can see that in SQL Server Management Studio 2016, we have this really nice feature that it actually does not require me to put the company name in front of the table. It actually recognizes the tables by itself, and I can just double click on this table, and now I can execute this query, right? So let's just quickly create a new code unit. I'm actually going to just delete these few code units. And let's just create a quick code unit with a global variable. The variable number is of type 18, and we're going to do customer.get. And we will get customer 10,000. And we will say customer.name equals Mark, customer.modify if confirm. This is the only way in Navision to stop a transaction. Never, ever do this unless you hate end users, right? And we will simply say error, I want to roll back the transaction, right? So what we have here is a simple piece of code. We read the customer from the database, we modify the name, then we hold the transaction. Now the transaction is not committed, so the transaction is still open, and we just error out, right? So let's save this code unit. We'll just call it 8888 Locktable code unit. And let's just execute this code unit. Now you running the code. This is the only way to stop Navision in a transaction. And let's see what happens now if we actually execute this query. You can see that currently this query is executing. If I zoom in, you will see that this query is executing. And the reason that this query is executing is not because this query is really expensive. It's not because this query is returning millions and millions and millions of rows. But the reason why this query is not executing anything is because currently I have issued a lock on one of the records in the table, right? And the default way that SQL Server works is that by default, SQL Server does not allow to read records which are locked in the database. And that is a fundamental principle in order to understand the rest of the webinar, right? Let's make a quick change to the code unit. let's X out of this one. Let's actually open the customer list. Now you can actually see we have customer 10,000 and customer number 20,000. What happens now if I run the code unit? If I run the code unit, this guy is actually executing. How do I figure out what I'm logging? Right? This is the million-dollar question, and with the introduction of NIV 2017, we have this nice new window which is actually telling us the database logs. This is now starting up a second session in the same database because this first session is still holding my log. And this guy is actually telling me that currently the logs in the database are these logs that I have in my system, right? So this is a really nice way to figure out what is going on. The reason why these guys are also locked is because in NAV 2017 we have an event subscriber, and the event subscriber is subscribing to code unit 1. This event subscriber is actually causing too many locks. I'll get back to that when we talk about the rest of the webinar. But let's first see what the effect is of the code that we have right here. Let's rerun the code unit. So now this client is actually running the code unit, and now what I do here is I can actually refresh the data. And I can see that currently I'm looking at a record which is called Mark, right? How is this possible? How is it possible that I'm actually looking at a record which is called Mark? Because I'm actually rolling back the transaction after I have completed it. And if I go back to SQL Server, if I now execute the query, it's actually not executing anything. And this is one of the primary differences between the SQL Server database and the native database. If we go to my blank PowerPoint slide, and there was actually a good reason why I had a blank PowerPoint slide, I actually wanted to have a pen. If this is my database, my native database, right? My native database, this is native. Let's see if I can actually write that. Native. Yeah. Native database has tables, and here we have the customer table and we have the vendor table, and the customer table has rows. What happens in native is if I go and if I actually want to modify this row, the native database has versioning. Versioning. This is very hard, actually. I don't recommend doing presentations like this. Versioning. And versioning means that as a user, I'm creating my own version of the record. If this is A, then this is A accent, and this is my record. And in the native database, all the other users were still looking at the old version of the table. And the native database would actually make this version obsolete as soon as my transaction is finished. And then A accent is the active version. In the native database, you could actually go back versions. If you had a guy who was capable of doing it, you could actually go back versions, and it's like the SQL Server transaction log. If you run SQL Server on full recovery mode, you can actually reverse the SQL Server transaction log or go back to your backup and append versions of the transaction log. And that's kind of how native worked as well. And the native database had optimistic concurrency, and with optimistic concurrency it meant that everybody was looking at the old data until you committed the row. SQL Server or native database also had table locking. The native database did not have row level locking, and we only got row level locking when we moved from the native database to the SQL Server database. SQL Server doesn't know this mechanism, right? At least SQL Server did not know it when we moved from native to SQL Server. With SQL Server, the optimistic concurrency of NAV is actually simulated using isolation levels. If I change the isolation level to with no lock, no, not no lock, no lock, right? If I go to change the isolation level to say with no lock, I actually, if I execute this query, I get a result set. And now you can also see that in my result set, I also have the record, which is changed. I'm not going to deep dive into isolation levels today. Actually, NAV is not using no-lock, and depending on the versions of Navision that you use, it's using read uncommitted or serializable or other stuff, and it's too complicated to talk about it today. But the most important thing to remember is that to mimic optimistic concurrency, SQL Server is reading dirty records in the database, right? And if I stop this transaction, if I now go back and yeah, here we go. If I refresh the record now here, and if I execute my query again, and now you can see that the data is rolled back, right? So what does this have to do with Locktable? Because currently the code is looking like this: customer.get, name, modify, if confirm, blah, blah, blah. What if we change the code a little bit and create a new code unit, and we'll just say we have record 18 customer, and we say customer.locktable, and Locktable, and we'll say customer.get 10,000, and let's go and say 88889 Locktable demo 2, and we are a bit lazy, so I'm going to just copy and paste this line of code, right? So if I now execute this code unit, this code unit is now issuing a lock. And if I go back to database logs, you can see that currently I only have one row lock because the modifier is not executed and the event subscriber is not subscribed. I currently only have one row lock. If I go to SQL Server and I just slash out this, I actually get a result set. And the reason I get a result set is because it's only an intent lock. It's not or it's a shared lock, right? It's really complicated thing to dive into today. But the thing is that if I go into this record now, if I go into customer number 10,000, if I try to change this now, if I say mark, if I try to say OK, I will get an error message. And I will get an error message after 10 seconds. For 10 seconds, Navision will try to do this change. For 10 seconds, it will try to wait until the previous guy is finished. This error is in Dutch. I will actually translate it for you. It says that a record in a customer table is locked, and I have to try it again. So what does it mean a record is locked? Does it mean that I can actually go into the second row and actually change it? Well, let's try. Let's go into this customer, and let's see if we can change this customer. And it worked. I can actually change this customer. I can probably change this customer, but I cannot change this customer, right? This is weird, because if I go to my code, I'm doing a Locktable, right? What does Locktable mean, right? Locktable is probably the most scary command in Navision. The reason Locktable is called Locktable is because in old days we had a native database, and in a native database it would actually lock the table. But we are not using a native database anymore. We have SQL Server database, and SQL Server does not know about explicit table locks. I mean, it knows about it, but Navision is not using it. Navision is using row level locking on SQL Server. And the only thing which is actually changed if I do a Locktable is if I say Locktable, I am asking the Navision backend engine to run this get statement with a different isolation level. This get statement is translated into select star, oh, not select latest version, select star from customer, where number equals 10,000 with update lock, right? Update lock means that nobody else can actually issue a lock on this table. Locktable is not locking tables. It's probably the most ambiguous command ever, and I have asked Microsoft multiple times to please change it to something else. Anything is better than Locktable. A suggestion would be to say customer.change isolation level to update lock, or I mean whatever, but just not call it Locktable anymore, right? So let's go back to the previous scenario, because with this scenario, the customer record also got locked, right? If we run this code, we could not actually run the SQL statement anymore. Let's make a quick change. Let's actually move the modify, and let's move the modify below the confirm. So now we are getting the customer, we are changing the name, then we are stopping the transaction, and then we are issuing a modify to SQL Server, right? Let's go back. Let's change this guy, and here we have the other guy. Let's run this code unit, and this guy is now doing the transaction. And if we refresh this, we don't get the change name. And now I can actually go in and change the name. I can say name number 2. And I can change it, right? Because if we go back to the code, we are not modifying it yet. How does Navision know which isolation level to use? The default isolation level is not using locks. Default isolation level is optimistic concurrency, right? So now I have actually changed the record. So what happens now if I go back to this transaction? Now I get an error message that the record has been updated, and I have to refresh it, right? So how do I change this behavior? Well, it's very easy. I have to tell Navision that I want to change the record. So Locktable is actually a really good command, right? Locktable is actually the way that I, as a Navision developer, tell the system what to do, right? In this case, I'm actually telling Navision that the thing I want to do with the customer is actually locking it. And now if I actually go into the system again, and I think both of them are fine. Yeah. Now if I actually run this code unit, now I told Navision to please isolate this record. So now if I go into the record, I can actually try to change it to Mark II. But it's not going to work because I told Navision to keep the lock for me, right? I can still change other customers, or I should be able to change other customers because it's row level locking. So if I go into this customer and I try to change it, it still works, right? It's not locking the table. I cannot say this enough. I have so many people in my masterclass that think that Locktable is actually locking the table. It's only changing the isolation level, right? So let's make it a little bit more interesting, if that's possible. Let's create another code unit. And this code unit will have 2 functions. The first function in this code unit will have a local variable of type customer and do a lock table. right? This is very self-explaining code. I don't even have to write the code for you to understand what I'm going to do. And then the second function will do a get on another local variable of the same table, right? These two functions will both have a local variable. This is going to be customer for Locktable. This is going to be customer for get. I love this variable, forget about customers. And I'm going to execute this code, and here I'm going to do customer for Locktable dot Locktable, and here I'm going to do a customer for get dot get, and I'm getting customer number 10,000, right? So now let's go back and we'll save this code unit, Locktable 3. I'll actually put these 3 code units on my GitHub after the presentation. Let's steal this line of code again. Let's put this, no, let's do it a different way. Let's just say if confirm, right? If confirm, $1 million question. What is the isolation level of this get statement, right? So let's look at the code. This is a local variable. This is a different local variable. And which is this Locktable going to be inherited to this local variable? And I know that 98% of the attendees of my masterclass think it's not going to be inherited. But of course, you can kind of guess that there is a reason why I'm going to show it to you. So everybody is now in fear mode. Everybody is in fear mode. So let's put a parentheses here. And let's see if everything is free. Yep. So we'll execute the code unit. And let's try to change this customer. And after 10 seconds, we'll get the same Dutch error message that the record is locked, right? Ooh, this is scary, right? The reason why Navision behaves like this is pure legacy. It's because the code base is 3 decades old, and changing this behavior may break a lot of existing code. So let's go back to this code unit, resource journal post line. And let's go back to this piece of code. What's going on here? What is going on here with the Locktable in the find last? Locktable is changing the isolation level, right? This changes the isolation level. And this tries to read the last committed, row, right? What happens if I post 5,000 lines and somebody else tries to post 1 line and my 5,000 lines take 15 minutes to post? The poor guy that tries to post 1 line is going to also try to find the last committed row, and he has to wait. After 10 seconds, he will get an error message that he has to wait. And he will try, and he will try, and he will try, and he will try to fire me if I do this more often. Why does Navision have this behavior? Because we are running SQL Server, and SQL Server has row-level locking. The reason that Navision is doing that is that the way that we make Navision auditable and traceable The way that we make sure that every customer that runs Navision doesn't have his CFO locked up in jail for fraud is that we have registers. And each time I post something to the register, I get a from entry number and a to entry number. And within one posting, I guarantee that nobody is using those numbers in between. And the register has sequential entry numbering. So I'm guaranteeing that if you do an audit of my system, that these numbers are always sequential, right? This is the way that Navision guarantees transaction integrity. And this is the way that your CFO is not going to jail if somebody really tries to audit your system. But the price that we have to pay for this is that we have to isolate every transaction. This Locktable and find last isolates every transaction. And this is the reason why until today in Navision you cannot post a purchase invoice and the sales invoice at the same time. This is why test near, test far, do it, clean up is so freakingly important. This is why you never write any tests, any business logic after this code, right? After this code, you want to be as fast as possible. There's no VAT calculation after this code. There's no discount calculation after this code. There's no web service after this code. After this code, nothing happens. You want to be as fast as possible, right? This is a simple example with the resource ledger entry. We have also the general ledger entry, and all the journals in Navision work the same. This is how GL works. This is how inventory works. This is how jobs works. This is how resource works. This is how the warehouse works. This is how everything in Navision works, right? Except reservations. Reservations don't have a journal. Reservations don't have a register. And in Navision, if I want, I can create multiple reservations at the same time. How is that possible? For those of you who have been with me with Navision for as long as I have, 10 years ago, reservations had a terrible reputation. Nobody used reservations 10 years ago in a large system. And the reason why we did not do that is if I create a new code unit. In the past, the way that reservations worked, in the past we would say reservation entry dot locktable if reservation entry dot find last, then reservation entry dot entry number plus equals 1, right? Locktable and find last have always been the standard way of incrementing entry numbers in Navision, right? Which is good if you want to have full traceability and auditability. If you want to have traceability using entry numbers, trust me, the only way is isolating the transaction. You can go to any Unisys or Unix DBA, and this is the only way to do it, right? But we are not doing that anymore. If I go back to the reservation entry table, and if I go to the properties of the entry number, you can see that we now have auto increment set to yes. Auto increment is a property that has been with us for a very long time, but it only has become extremely interesting since we moved completely to SQL Server, since we moved the native database, and since we moved to the service tier. Since we moved to the service tier, everything that happens on SQL Server is done by the DB owner. The user who is running the service tier is a DB owner in the SQL Server database. And let me see what I get if I run my reservation entry table. Reservation entries come in pairs, right? I have a positive reservation and a negative reservation, and both have the same entry number. The next pair will have number 2. The next pair will have number 3, right? And the reason why this is happening is because reservation entries have auto-increment. And auto-increment enables SQL Server identity insert. If you Google on SQL Server identity insert, you will find that identity insert is a standard way for SQL Server to increment entry numbers. If you do that, if you enable identity insert on SQL Server will memorize the last entry number that you have used, and it will automatically increment the next entry number with 1, right? The penalty for that is if you have a transaction and the transaction creates 5 entries, and your transaction is rolled back, those numbers will be forgotten and never reused. Let's quickly create a new table. And let's say we have entry number, integer, and description, text 30, and we'll call this 67890 auto increment demo, and we'll put this guide to auto increment yes. Right. Oh, this is a bug in the vision, 67890. It doesn't memorize that auto increment is changed, so it doesn't ask me to save the table. If I run this table, I get a clean slate, and if I now start adding records, I get A, B, C, D, E, F, right? And I don't have to do anything for the numbering. It's happening automatically by SQL Server identity insert. But if I delete a record and try to recreate it, it continues with 7. I can manually reinsert number 6, but I can only do that if I'm DB owner. But because Navision runs on the service tier and SQL in the service tier as DB owner, I can always recreate entries with the same number. And that is exactly how reservations work, right? Reservations work by the fact that we have auto increment set to yes, which enables identity insert. And I don't have to do a Locktable and a find last. I don't have to isolate every transaction. And this is good because reservation entries are created during the order entry process, right? The reservation entries are designed to be deleted when the reservation entry is no longer needed, which is when we ship the items. I think the company in the world that has the most reservation entries ever is Tesla, because people are crazy enough to buy a Tesla 3 years in advance, right? And then the reservation entry will actually exist for 3 years, right? But any other system will probably only have reservation entries for the time that you manufacture your items in China and you get them to your warehouse and then you ship them. So after 3 months or 6 months, all your reservation entries will be deleted. So the reservation entry table will always be extremely small, right? With reservation, we don't care about auditability and traceability. Right? Nobody is going to fire your CFO if you delete reservation entries. It's not legally binding to not mess with your reservation entries. Right? It's not as important as the GL. Right? So the question is, why is the reservation, the GL entry table, why is the GL entry table not auto increment? What happens if I do this? Right? What happens if I make the GL entry table auto increment? Could I make Navision post to the GL at the same time? That's an interesting question. And the answer to the question actually is yes. Yes, if you really want to, you can actually make this change and you can post to the GL entry at the same time. But you have to make some changes. The first change that you have to make is that you can no longer have the GL register. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I mean, we have products like FastPath, and FastPath allows you to do tracking and auditing and make sure that your CFO is not fired, not by doing it in Navision, but actually auditing SQL Server. And I think auditing SQL Server is a much smarter thing than auditing it via NAV. The second thing you have to change is that the customer ledger entry and the vendor ledger entry can no longer have the same number as the GL entry because you don't have the number of the GL entry before you actually insert it. But then you will run into another issue. Actually, Microsoft prototyped this. Microsoft spent considerable amount of time prototyping if they could actually make this work. And the issue they run into is deadlocks. And users hate 2 types of messages. The first type of message is the one that I just showed you, where you get a message that another user has changed the record after you have read it from the database. That's a very frustrating message. But if a user gets a message in their face with the word dead, they don't appreciate it. Nobody likes to have the word dead smashed in their face. And the reason we get deadlocks is because in NAV we have the concept of some index fields. Every key in Navision has some index fields. And some index fields are making sure that we don't have any business logic in Navision that creates a total for the chart of accounts. If I open the chart of accounts in NAV, and let's just close this client, and let's go here and go into chart of accounts. The chart of accounts is always calculated on the fly. And the reason why we can calculate the chart of accounts on the fly is because if we go into the Navision database and we go into views, we have a view for every sum index field. So here we have GL entry number 1, 2, 8, and 9. And let me zoom into that because this is very small. We have 1, 2, 8, and 9. And if I expand number 1, you will see we have a bunch of columns. The GL account number, the posting date, the count of records, and then a bunch of sums. And if we go back to Seaside, you will see that this is exactly the same definition as I have here in my sum index fields, right? These are my sum index fields, and these are my fields in my key, right? So this view in SQL Server contains the aggregated totals for the chart of accounts, which is fine because it's just a view. But the view becomes a table when you index it. If you add a clustered index to a view, the index, the view becomes a table. And each time I create a record in the GL entry table, I not only have to create an entry in the table, I also have to create an entry in the table view, right? So for each insert, I have to either update or insert a record in the view. And SQL Server does not guarantee that every time you do that, the SIFT is updated in the same execution order. And you will actually create deadlocks, right? So how does that work with the reservation entry table? Because the reservation entry table also has some index views. Let's right mouse click here and say show column, and we'll enable all these guys here, and you can see that the column for maintain SIFT index is disabled. If you disable this column, the SIFT on SQL Server will not be generated. And if the SIFT does not exist, then the sum of the calculation will be calculated on the real table, which is fine for reservation entries because reservation entries only exist for a period in time until your sales cycle is completed, and then the reservation table reservation entries are deleted. But the GL is a data cemetery, right? You only get in, you never get out, right? So after a while, your GL entry, your GL will be so big that opening the chart of accounts will take forever. And this is the primary difference. The good news is that Microsoft is actually looking into this. There is a chance that in the next version of NAV, or maybe the version after that, we will get a way of posting to the GL entry at the same time. But until then, I don't actually recommend trying to do this. Of course, what you could do is you can go and go into the keys, and you can say, I only want to have one. If I only have one SIFT, I cannot have deadlocks on the SIFT. But until then, I would actually, I don't advise to make the change in NAV to make the GL entry auto increment. What I would recommend, if you have a large Navision installation, I do recommend to go into the sales line table and disable the SIFT on the sales line, because I know that large NAV installations often have deadlocks on sales lines because everybody is keying in sales orders at the same time, and then they try to update the same SIFT tables and they get deadlocks on the SIFT table. Wow, 45 minutes, I made it. And I have 15 minutes left for Q&A. This is what I wanted to share with you, and I'm wondering if we have questions. I'm opening the question window now. Anyone? This is always an awkward moment. You're doing a webinar, you're talking into thin air for 45 minutes. You see that we have 60 attendees and nobody is saying anything. Okay, we have one question, maintain SQL index and maintain SIFT index. What is the difference? Okay, that's a good question. If we go into the GL entry table and we go back to the keys, here we have two columns. One column is maintain SIFT index and the other one is maintain SQL index. If you disable maintain SIFT index, I'll actually do it. I don't care. If I disable this, it'll take, if it's a large database, it'll take a while. But if I now go back to my views and I refresh my views, I only have two, right? Let me zoom in. I only have two, right? If I go into my tables, and here I have my GL entry table. They are all alphabetically sorted, so here I have my GL entry table. On a GL entry table, I have indexes, and we have index number 1, 2, 5, 7, blah, blah, blah. And I go back to C side, and here we have index number 1, 2, and then you have 3 and 4 are missing, right? 3 and 4 here are missing. I only have 2 and 5, and then it continues. If I go and disable maintain SQL index, and if I save the table, and if I now refresh my indexes, I have less indexes, right? This is actually old stuff. In older versions of Navision, if I go and create a new code unit, and let me just say I have a variable. Let me get my stuff out of the way here. I have record 17 GL entry table. I can say GL entry dot set current key, and I can say amount, right? In NAV 2013, R2, 2015, 2016, 2017, I can do a set current key on every field in the database. And I don't need to have a key in order to do a set current key. If I now do a GL entry.find last, and I do message format GL entry dot amount, and I save this guy 7 whatever XX, and now I actually get an amount. And in older versions of Navision, there was a difference between, if I go into my keys, in older versions of Navision, there was a difference between disabling a key and disabling the SQL index. But in modern versions of Navision, you actually don't need a key to do a set current key, right? So I hope that answered your question. Which SIFT can I disable on the sales line? If you have a normal Navision system that doesn't have 20 million sales lines, you can actually disable all the SIFT on the sales lines. So we have another question. So Mark, once again, what is the concept of maintain SIFT index? I hope that that is now more clear. Now I repeated it again. Is SIFT indexes supported in the new development environment? Yes. I have Navision open. I have the development environment open here. If I go into a table in the new development environment, and let's just go to a simple table. This is here we have keys, and if I go into my key and I hit Control Space, you will see that I have maintained SIFT index, I have maintained SQL index, SQL index, and some index fields. I actually asked Microsoft the question, what's the sense of doing this in AppSource? Because in AppSource, there's no way of you as a developer to know which indexes to create. If you have an app on AppSource and you have 1,200 users using your app, then they will use the app in different ways. So it's actually going to be interesting to see how this will work. Okay, so we have a newbie question from Tim. What is the scope or the effect of Locktable in your code? I did not quite get that. So Locktable is changing the isolation level. So if you program a Locktable, you are explicitly asking SQL Server to place a row lock on your record. If I do a get like here, the isolation level is not locking the record. And if I do a Locktable, it's actually locking the row in the database. So with Locktable, you're explicitly telling the Navision engine which record to, which isolation level to use. But okay, so Tim asks, when does the isolation level return to normal? When the transaction ends. So when the posting routine has come to a finish. There is a trick to read something. So let's go back to CodeUnit 2.1.2, right? Here we have this piece of code, Locktable and findLast. This is locking the last row in the table. If I now do a resource ledger entry dot find set, after this find set, the table is locked, right? Because now it has to go through the entire data set, and it will lock everything in the database. What you can actually do is you can actually create a query. Queries are the most underestimated and underpowered objects in the database. Most of the people after my masterclass all of a sudden start creating queries. I don't know why. But if I create a new query and I create a query on the customer table and I just slap in a couple of fields, the query has its own isolation level. And of course, we are not using the term isolation level. That will be too easy. We have the term read state, but here we have read uncommitted, read shared, or read exclusive. So queries are actually a workaround to read data without locking after the Locktable has been issued on a certain record in the database. But the easiest way to avoid locking is to make your posting routines as fast as possible. And the most frequently made mistake that I see is that people will call web services after doing the Locktable. People will actually calculate VAT. People will send emails. People will do the craziest stuff in the posting routine after the Locktable. And all of that stuff has to be done before the Locktable. That's why I always tell the students of my class, test near, test far, do it, and then clean up. And everything that you do before the do it has to be non-locking. Kind of lost sight of my questions here. See you at NAV Tech Days? Yes, of course. See you at Tech Days. Okay, I think I covered all the questions. If you typed in a question and you think I did not cover it, please type it again because I kind of lost the overview here. otherwise, I would like to thank you for attending this webinar. I know it was a lot of information. Okay, we have one more question. Christine, in a processing report that loops through multiple records, modifying each one, would you put a log table on the after get records trigger code? Well, Navision is automatically moving into a different transaction mode. Let's go back to the other code unit. Let's go back to, I think it was this code unit, right? Let's go back to this code unit. When Navision executes this line of code, which isolation level is used, right? This is used no locking, right? Then Navision executes this line of code. And the question is, can I modify a record if I don't lock it? And the answer is no. Relational databases use locking. If we don't lock, we don't have a rollback. The only way we have transaction integrity in SQL Server is because we have locking. So what happens here with modify is I actually issue two select statements to SQL Server. The first time I actually issue this get statement, I do select star from customer where customer number is 10,000 with no lock. And the second time it's doing select star from customer with update lock, right? So actually this is very expensive. This is actually reading the data twice. So Christine, if you have a report which updates the records in a loop, then Navision will automatically switch to a different isolation mode after the first modify. If I program something like this, customer.get 20,000, this get statement, get 20,000, this get statement is also locking. After you modify something, everything in the same transaction will automatically lock. So now we get $1 million question, right? We always have this question. Does commit in the code revert log table? Yes, a commit revert the log table. But please don't do that, right? Because a commit will actually stop your relational database from having to do a rollback, right? We have one more question, and I think we have to wrap up because we're at the top of the hour, and I have a meeting another meeting in 2 minutes. Why is the line locking also locking the previous rec of a record set? Werner, this is not true anymore. What you are referring to is called locking by neighboring. In older versions of Navision, if I go into, I know. In older versions of Navision, if I go into my sales order processing and my sales orders, in older versions of Navision, if I have a sales order and my sales order has more lines, it would lock the entire set of lines. And the reason why older versions of Navision did that was that during the posting of an invoice, you don't want people to sneak into your document and sneak in a line. Because of that behavior in older versions of Navision, we had locking by neighboring. And Microsoft discontinued locking by neighboring since NAV 2013, right? So Werner, that's old school Navision. It's not true anymore. I have to wrap up. Thanks for attending this webinar. If you want to slowly but surely listen to it again, the webinar will be on YouTube in the next couple of days, and then you can listen to it again. Or of course, you're always welcome to meet me in person at one of my workshops. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Rick.